My hand was on the lid of the box when the murmuring started behind me. 200 people in a ballroom in Lake Forest, Illinois, and every one of them had just watched me walk to that gift table like I had a right to be there. Somebody laughed, quiet, quick, covered fast. I did not turn around. I kept my hand on the lid and waited for my son to look at what was inside. That part comes later. First, you need to know how we got here. 4 weeks earlier, I was in the shed behind my house in Northport, Wisconsin, oiling the hinges on an old toolbox, when my wife came out with an envelope in her hand and a look on her face I had not seen since the year our roof caved in during a February storm. Nell did not say good morning. She said, "Derek sent something." That was all. I wiped my hands on a rag and took the envelope from her. It was not a card. It was a printed letter, 4 pages, single-spaced, from my son. 36 years old, a surgeon in Milwaukee. 3 weeks from marrying a woman named Whitney Calloway. The letter opened with a paragraph about wanting the wedding to run smoothly for everyone involved, and then it got to the point. 20 conditions. That was the word he used. Conditions for his own parents to attend his own wedding. The first one said Nell and I would sit at a table near the kitchen doors, table number 19, so as not to disrupt the flow of the reception photographs. I read that twice, thinking I had misunderstood something about seating charts I did not know existed. I had not misunderstood anything. The second condition said I was not permitted to wear my Coast Guard service ring because it would, in Derek's exact words, clash with the formality of the evening. I kept reading. The fifth condition told us not to bring up my old job at the lighthouse in conversation with Whitney's family, since occupation talk could feel again his words out of place in that setting. I had spent 22 years keeping a light burning on Lake Michigan, so ships would not run aground on rock they could not see. My son wanted me to leave that at home, like a coat that did not match the room. Nell stood in the doorway of the shed, watching my face while I read. She had not opened the letter herself. She told me later she could not make herself finish it after the first page, so she brought it straight to me instead, the way you hand someone a phone when the call is for them and you do not want to be the one who answers first. Condition 11 said any gift for the couple needed pre-approval from Derek before the wedding, submitted by photograph. No handmade items permitted under any circumstances. My hands, I want to be honest, had built half the furniture in my son's childhood bedroom. I did not say anything out loud. I set the letter down flat on the workbench and pressed both palms against the wood, the way you do when you need the wood to hold you up instead of the other way around. Then I got to condition 12, and that one stopped me completely. It said I was not to tell, quote, the lighthouse story, unquote, to anyone at the reception because it tended to, and this is Derek's language, dominate conversations and pull attention away from the couple. He did not name the story. He did not have to. There was only one story in our family that people asked me to tell twice. The night in 1987, during a storm that closed the harbor for 3 days, when I went out in a borrowed boat and pulled 3 men out of water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. I had told that story at family dinners for 37 years. Derek used to ask me to tell it when he was young, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor, wanting to hear the part about the wind again. Now it was condition 12 on a list forbidden because it dominated conversations. I read the sentence 3 times to make sure I understood what I was reading, and each time it said the same thing. Nell crossed the shed and stood beside me. She had not asked what was in the letter yet. She was watching my hands instead, which had gone still on the edge of the workbench, and my hands more than my face have always told her what she needed to know after 41 years of marriage. "Jean," she said, and stopped herself because that was not my name. That was a habit from an old joke between us that only came out when she was frightened. "Marcus, what does it say?" I had read exactly 12 of the 20 conditions. My throat had gone dry enough that I had to clear it before I could get a full sentence out, and even then what came out was not really an answer. "How many," I said, "are there?" She looked at the envelope still in her other hand, the one holding the remaining pages I had not touched yet. And her face changed in a way I will remember for the rest of my life, because it was the exact moment my wife understood before I did, that this letter was not going to be the kind of thing we laughed about later. "Marcus," she said again, quieter this time. How many are there? I did not have an answer for her yet. I turned back to the letter in my hands and I kept reading. By the time Nell found me in the workshop that night, the brass anemometer clock on the wall had gone silent for the first time in 6 years, and there was a tin box lying open on the floor with its lid bent backward. I want to tell you how it got that way before I tell you what fell out of it, because the order matters. 20, I had told Nell back in the shed, closing the letter. That was the answer to her question. 20 conditions, and I had only read 12 of them out loud in my head before my legs decided they needed to move somewhere else. I did not explain further. I folded the pages, put them in my jacket pocket, and told her I needed a few minutes alone with the boat engine I had been rebuilding in the garage. She let me go. 41 years of marriage teaches a woman exactly which silences to interrupt and which ones to leave standing. This was the second kind. I walked past the kitchen on my way out, and I saw the letter still sitting where I had left it. Pages spread across the counter, condition 12, visible under the overhead light. I did not stop to read it again. I had already memorized more of it than I wanted to admit. The way you memorize the exact words of a bad diagnosis, without meaning to, simply because your mind will not let the sentence go. I did not go near the boat engine. I went into the back workshop instead. The small room off the garage where I keep the tools from the lighthouse days. The ones the Coast Guard let me buy for $1 each when they decommissioned the station in 1994. On the wall above the bench hangs the anemometer clock brass, housing a needle that used to track wind speed off the top of the tower. It has not measured wind in 30 years. I wind it anyway, every night at 7 o'clock. The way I did on shift, because a habit that old does not know it is retired. That night I stood in front of it at 7 o'clock exactly, key in my hand, and I could not make my fingers turn it. I do not have a clean explanation for why. I had wound that clock through worse nights than this one. I had wound it the week my father died, the week my hip gave out on the ice, the week Nell's mother passed in the back bedroom of this house with both of us holding her hands. This was different. This was my own son, telling me in writing, in 20 separate numbered points, that the man who wound that clock every night was an embarrassment he needed to manage. I put the key down on the bench and turned toward the storage cabinet instead. The old oak one built into the corner, looking for something to do with my hands that was not standing still. My shoulder caught the cabinet door harder than I meant to. It swung open and a tin box on the top shelf, one I did not remember putting there, tipped forward and hit the workbench with a flat, hollow sound before it dropped to the floor and the lid sprang loose. I stood over it for a moment without picking anything up. The box had come to rest upside down, and what had been inside it was now scattered across the floorboards in a loose fan, a dozen envelopes, at least, maybe more, each one sealed, each one with a single word written on the front in Nell's careful handwriting. The same word over and over. Derek. I crouched down slowly, my knee complaining about it the way any, and I picked up the nearest one. The paper had gone soft at the corners, the way paper does when it has been handled many times and put away many times. There was no postmark. There was no stamp. None of them had ever been mailed. I turned it over in my hands twice before I understood what I was looking at. These were not copies of letters. These were the letters themselves, written and sealed and never sent. And there were enough of them stacked in that tin box that I could not have counted them in the dark, even if my hands had been steady enough to try. I heard the door from the garage open behind me. Nell stood in the doorway with the dish towel still over one shoulder, the way she carries it when she has walked away from the sink mid-task because something pulled her attention somewhere else. She looked at the envelopes fanned across the floor. She looked at the one in my hand with Derek's name on it in her own writing. And her face did something I had not seen it do in 41 years, not once, not even the week her mother died. She looked caught. Neither of us moved for a moment. The dish towel slid off her shoulder and landed across two of the envelopes, and she left it there, rather than reach past me to move it. "Nell," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, which surprised me more than the letters did. "How long have you been writing to him?" She did not answer right away. She crossed the workshop, knelt down across from me on the same worn floorboards, and started gathering the envelopes into a pile with both hands, not looking at me. The way you gather something you are not ready to explain yet, but cannot leave scattered on the floor either. 18 years, she said finally, still not looking up. He was 18 the first time I wrote one. Why didn't you send them? She stacked the last envelope onto the pile and set both hands flat on top of it, holding it still. Because the first one was angry, and I didn't want that to be the first thing he read from me in writing, and after that I suppose I got used to writing them instead of saying them out loud. I looked at the box between us, at the dozen or more envelopes she was stacking with careful hands, each one addressed and sealed and never sent. And I understood before she said another word that whatever was in them was going to be worse and better than anything written on Derek's list. Read them, Nell said, quietly pushing the pile an inch closer to me across the floorboards. Before you decide what to think about any of this tonight, read them first. The number at the bottom of the first letter was $31,400, and I want to tell you that number before I tell you anything else about that night, because it is the number that changed how I understood my own marriage. I opened the letter dated the year Derek turned 18. Nell sat across from me on the workshop floor, knees pulled up, watching me read instead of reading it herself, since she already knew every word by heart. The letter opened plainly. Dear Derek, I am not sending this, but I need you to exist somewhere, even if only in a drawer. Then it went on to explain in careful handwriting exactly where that $31,400 had come from over 4 years, $100 at a time from substitute teaching shifts she had never told me about. Taken on weekends, I thought she was visiting her sister in Green Bay. I read the rest of that first letter twice. She had itemized it almost like a ledger, 4 columns down the page, dates and amounts, and the reason behind each one. Substitute teaching at the elementary school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a stretch of extra Saturday shifts the spring. Derek needed a car to get to his internship, money folded into an envelope and carried to the bank on her lunch break, so the deposit would never show up on a day I might notice it on the statement. It was not written like a confession. It was written like a record, the kind you keep because someday you might need to prove to yourself that something actually happened. I set that letter down and picked up the next one without looking at Nell, because I did not trust my face yet. The second letter was shorter. It was dated the week I fell on the ice tower stairs during my last winter at the lighthouse. The fall that left me with the limp I still carry 20 years later. Nell had written it the night I came home from the hospital. It said she had sat in that waiting room for 6 hours, certain I was going to lose the leg, and that Derek, 17 at the time, had called once from a friend's house, stayed on the phone for 3 minutes, asked if I was going to be okay, and hung up before she could tell him the doctors did not know yet. 3 minutes. I had never known that detail. I had assumed all these years that he simply had not called at all, and somehow the truth was worse. He was a kid, I said out loud, mostly to myself. I know, Nell said. I wasn't angry at him. I was angry that I couldn't tell anyone how frightened I was, so I told a piece of paper instead. I picked up a third letter, then a fourth, reading faster now, the way you read when you have stopped being able to slow yourself down. Each one covered a year I remembered differently than the version on the page. The year Derek's college tuition came due, and I told everyone. We had planned well enough to cover it, when in fact Nell had quietly sold her mother's wedding ring to a jeweler in Sturgeon Bay, and never once mentioned it. The year I worked 6 months of double shifts at the ferry station and came home too tired to notice that our savings account, according to her letter, had somehow not dropped the way it should have because she had been feeding money into it from a second job at the school cafeteria that I had never asked enough questions about. The ring, I said, looking up from that page. You told me you lost it swimming at your sister's lake house. I felt terrible about that for a year. I know you did. She did not apologize for it. I let you feel terrible instead of letting Derek's tuition bill go unpaid. And I would make the same choice again tonight if you asked me to. Every letter ended the same way. Not sent. Not sent. Not sent. I got to the last one in the box. The most recent dated only 3 months earlier, and it was different from the others. It was not about money. There was no ledger in it, no dates, no dollar amounts carried down the margin. It was one paragraph long, and it said that she had read a magazine article about parents becoming strangers to their adult children, that she had sat with the magazine open on her lap for 20 minutes afterward without turning the page, and that she was terrified this had already happened to us and Derek. She wrote that she did not know how to say that out loud without sounding like she was accusing him of something he had not chosen on his own. So she had put it in a drawer with the rest instead, the way she had put everything else that frightened her. I looked up at her. She was watching my hands again the way she always does, waiting to read them before I said anything. $31,400, I said. You never told me. You would have told me not to bother. Her voice did not waver. And you would have been wrong, and I didn't want to argue about it for 4 years while it needed doing. I did not have an answer for that. I sat on the workshop floor with 18 years of my wife's handwriting spread across my knees next to a letter from my own son telling me not to mention my career at his wedding, and for the first time since the envelope had arrived that afternoon, I understood that the 20 conditions were not the worst thing that letter had done to our house tonight. They had simply been the thing that knocked the tin box off the shelf. There was a knock at the garage door. 3 knocks evenly spaced, the way only one person on our road has ever knocked, 40 years running. Nell and I looked at each other, and neither of us moved to answer it right away, because it was past 9 o'clock, and Odell Baque did not come by after dark unless something was sitting on his chest heavy enough that he could not carry it to morning. I gathered the letters back into the tin box, closed the lid, and set it on the bench next to the Animaneater clock I still had not wound. Nell wiped her face once with the back of her hand, stood, and opened the door. Odell stood on the step in his work jacket, a mug of coffee in one hand, even though it was well past coffee hours, and the particular stillness on his face of a man who has been rehearsing what he is about to say since before he left his own house. "Marcus," he said, "I need to tell you some things. Things I probably should have told you a long time ago." Odell did not sit down right away. He stood just inside the garage door with his coffee mug held in both hands, steam long gone, looking at the tin box still sitting on my workbench, like it had already told him more than he wanted to know before he said a word. The overhead bulb buzzed faintly, the way it always does past a certain hour, and outside, through the small window over the bench, I could see his own porch light burning across the road, the one Betty leaves on for him whenever he steps out after dark. "Sit, Odell," Nell said, pulling the third stool over from the corner. "Whatever it is, you didn't drive over here at 9 o'clock to say it standing up." He sat. He set the mug down without drinking from it. For a man who had lived across the road from me for 40 years, who had never once in that time hesitated to tell me my roof needed replacing or my truck was overdue for an oil change, the silence stretching out of him now was unfamiliar enough that I found myself bracing for it before he opened his mouth. "You remember when Derek started medical school?" he said finally, setting the mug down for good this time. "Milwaukee. 19 years old. First one in either of our families to go anywhere near a university like that. I remember. You remember a boy named Preston Ashcombe? Roommate his first year. I did remember him, vaguely, the way you remember a name attached to a handful of holiday dinners 2 decades back. Tall boy, good teeth, the kind of easy charm that made older relatives assume he came from money even before anyone confirmed it. He had shown up at our table exactly twice, both times complimenting the meal in a way that somehow made the kitchen feel smaller rather than larger. He had stopped coming around after that first year, and I had never thought much about why. I ran into him at a hardware store in Sturgeon Bay a few summers ago, Odell said. Buying pipe fittings, of all things, still with that same look about him, like the store owed him something for his time. He didn't recognize me, but I recognized him. And I got to talking with the fellow working the register, who, it turns out, went to high school with Preston's cousin. Odell paused, rubbing one thumb along the handle of the mug. You know how it is in a store like that. Nobody's in a hurry. One thing led to another. He turned the coffee mug a quarter turn on the workbench, not drinking it, just needing his hands to do something. The cousin told him Preston used to talk about Derek's old man like a punchline, the lighthouse keeper. Said it like it was something you'd find funny at a party. I felt that land somewhere under my ribs, a slow, cold pressure, not sharp, yet more like the moment before a wave finishes rising. He told people I ran a lighthouse for a laugh, not just that. Odell's jaw tightened, and he shifted his weight on the stool before he went on. The cousin said Preston used to tell Derek straight to his face that a man could either come from somewhere small or go somewhere big, but he couldn't do both forever. Said it like advice, like he was doing the boy a favor. Odell looked at me directly now, the way he does when he has decided the kind thing and the honest thing are not the same thing tonight, and he has chosen honest. He told Derek that a father who worked with his hands his whole life was something a son could either carry or set down, and that a smart man sets it down before it slows him up. Nell made a sound beside me, small, involuntary, the kind of sound a person makes when a fact lands somewhere it cannot be unheard. I did not make a sound. I sat very still on that stool, and I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment, even though I did not say a word of it out loud to either of them then or for a long time after. I felt the particular kind of pressure a man feels behind his sternum when he understands all at once that a wound he assumed was an accident of distance and time was in fact planted, not fallen, planted deliberately by someone standing close enough to Derek to choose exactly where the roots would go. I had spent 19 years telling myself that my son had simply drifted the way sons drift, the ordinary erosion of a life lived somewhere else. I had never once considered that someone might have stood at the edge of that drift with a shovel. I did not say any of that. What I said was Derek never repeated a word of it to me. There was something else underneath what I said. Something I did not put into words for either of them that night, and I will put it into words now only because it belongs to the truth of what happened. What I felt sitting on that stool was not only the sting of Preston's words, it was the older, colder recognition of my own father's voice 40 years back, telling a 9-year-old boy at a funeral that men on the water do not have room for tears, only for work. I had spent my whole life proving I was not that kind of man. With Derek warm where my father had been flint, present where he had been absent, and some version of that same lesson had found its way to my son anyway. Delivered by a different mouth, dressed up as advice instead of grief. No, Odell said. He wouldn't have. Not because he agreed with it, because he was 19 and he loved you, and Preston Ashcombe had a way of making shame feel like sophistication if you were young enough not to recognize the difference. Nell reached over and put her hand flat against the middle of my back. Not rubbing it, not moving it, just resting it there, the way you brace something that has taken a hit and might still be finding its footing. There's more, Odell said, and something in the way he said it, quiet, almost apologetic, told me this was not the part he had come over to say. This was only the part that made the rest of it possible to say at all. What else? I said. He looked down at the coffee mug again, turning it a slow half-circle without lifting it. Betty had asked him twice that evening, he told us later, whether he was really going to walk across the road that night, or wait until morning, and both times he had said morning, and both times he had put his coat on anyway, within the hour. Whatever was coming had clearly cost him something just to carry across the road tonight, and I could see him deciding right there in front of me whether he still had it in him to say the rest before the night got any later. Odell set his coffee mug down on the workbench for good this time, both hands flat on either side of it, the posture of a man bracing to say something he cannot take back once it is out of his mouth. Outside, the wind had picked up off the water, rattling the loose gutter at the corner of the garage, the way it did most nights past 10, a sound so familiar to both of us that neither one so much as glanced toward it. You know Priya Reyes, he said, Theo's wife. Teaches chemistry over at the high school. I know Priya. She and Theo drove down to Milwaukee back in February, when Derek had that bad flu going around. You remember Nell made the cherry pie? The big one drove it down herself because Derek said he couldn't keep anything else down. Nell's hand had gone still against my back. I remember, she said quietly. I dropped it off on a Tuesday morning. Whitney answered the door. She was very kind about it. Said she'd make sure Derek ate some. Nell paused, and I watched her reach for the rest of that memory, the way you reach for a photograph to check it still looks the way you remember it. She even asked if the crust was supposed to be that dark on top. I told her that was the sugar caramelizing on, and she wrote it down on her phone like she meant to remember it.
That's what she told you?
Odell said. Priya and Theo happened to be parked 2 houses down that same morning, dropping off a housewarming gift for a different friend on that street, and Priya saw the whole thing from the car. She wasn't looking to see anything. She just happened to be looking out the window at the right or the wrong moment. I felt my stomach tighten before he even said it, the way you brace for a blow you can already see coming, but cannot get out of the way of in time. Whitney carried that pie around the side of the house. Odell said, not 10 minutes after you drove off, Nell. Priya watched her walk it straight to the garbage cans, tin and all, and dump it in. Didn't even take the foil off first. Nobody spoke for a moment. The bulb over the workbench buzzed on, indifferent to what it was lighting. Maybe there was something wrong with it, Nell said, and her voice had the particular brittleness of a woman trying on an excuse she does not believe, just to see if it fits well enough to survive the night. Maybe it had gone bad in the car. Maybe she thought it wasn't safe to give someone who was already sick. Priya said she rinsed the tin out with the garden hose after, Odell said gently. Set it back on the porch step clean as new, so it'd be sitting right there waiting for you next time you came by to collect it. Which, he added, I understand you did. Few weeks later. I looked at Nell. I watched something behind her eyes recalculate every version of that story she had been telling herself since February. The version where her son's fiancé was simply cautious, or forgetful, or overwhelmed with wedding planning. Folding one after another into a version that could no longer stand up on its own. She thanked me for the recipe, Nell said very quietly. 2 weeks later, asked if I'd write it down for her. I did. I sat at that same kitchen table you're sitting at now and wrote it out by hand, because she said she wanted to make it for Derek herself sometime. Maybe she did, I said, though I did not believe it. And I do not think Nell believed it either. I said it the way you offer a hand to someone standing at the edge of something, not because you think it will hold their weight, but because it is the only thing within reach. Odell did not say anything else about it. He had told us what he came to tell us, and he was not a man who padded a hard truth with more words than it needed. He picked his coffee mug back up, drank what was left of it cold, and set it down one final time. I'm not saying any of this to stir something up between you and that family before a wedding, he said. I've known you both too long to enjoy delivering news like this, but you were about to walk into that room in 3 weeks not knowing what kind of house your son is marrying into, and I couldn't sit across the road watching you do that with my mouth shut. I did not answer him right away. I sat with my hands on my knees looking at the tin box on the workbench, at the letters inside it, at the coffee mug Odell had just set down at the 20 conditions still folded in my jacket pocket. And I felt something in me settle into a shape it had not held an hour earlier. Something quieter than anger, and heavier than anger I have found over 69 years. Tends to move fast and burn itself out just as quickly. This was not that. This moved slow, the way water finds the lowest point in a foundation over years instead of days. Patient enough that you do not notice the damage until something finally gives. I stood up. My hip complained the way it always does when I have been sitting too long on a hard stool, and I let it complain without answering it. I need to go out to the shed, I said. I did not explain what for. I am not sure standing there that I could have explained it even if either of them had asked. Mel did not ask. She had learned over 41 years exactly which of my silences meant I needed company, and exactly which ones meant I needed a workbench and a closed door, and enough hours alone to figure out what my hands were going to do about something my mouth could not yet say. Odell stood as well, pulling his jacket straight, and for a moment the three of us stood in that small garage without anyone moving toward the door. He looked older than he had when he walked in, the way a man does after he has finally set down something heavy he has been carrying alone for a while. I should have told you about the pie sooner, he said. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. I've told myself that about a lot of things where that family's concerned, and I'm done telling myself that tonight. You did right by us, Odell, Nell said, and she meant it. I could hear that she meant it, even with her voice still thin around the edges. Tonight and every other time you've ever come across that road. He nodded once, the kind of nod that ends a conversation rather than continuing it, and let himself out through the side door into the dark. I heard his boots on the graveled driveway, unhurried, and a moment later his own porch light clicked brighter across the road, the way it did every night when Betty heard him coming up the walk. Nell stayed where she was for a moment after the door closed, looking at the tin box, at the coffee mug, at everything Odell had left sitting on that workbench besides the coffee itself. "Go," she said finally when I did not move right away. "I'll be inside. Take whatever time you need out here." The ship's clock had been sitting in the bottom drawer of my workbench for 37 years, wrapped in the same oilcloth I had wrapped it in the night I pulled it off the deck of a capsized cruiser on Lake Michigan, and in all that time, I had never once tried to fix it. I had moved that drawer with me through 2 different workbenches and 1 full renovation of the shed, and each time I packed it up I told myself the same thing, that it did not need fixing, that some things were better left exactly as the water left them. I took it out that night after Odell left, unwrapped the oilcloth with hands that were steadier than I expected them to be, and set it down under the work light. Brass housing 8 inches across the glass face cracked in a long diagonal line from the night the boat rolled, and threw it against a cleat. The hands had stopped at 11:42, and they had stayed there every single time I had taken it out to look at it over the decades, which was not often, maybe once every 5 years. Always late at night. Always alone, always wrapped back up and put away again within the hour. I do not talk about that night. I want to be honest about that before I go any further. I have told the bare outline of it exactly as many times as I have needed to at Derek's request when he was young enough to ask at a few dinners over the years where somebody brought it up, and each time I have kept the telling short, factual, the way you'd report a bearing over a radio. Storm came in fast that October. Boat went over about a mile off the point. I took the department launch out against orders because the Coast Guard cutter was 40 minutes out and I was 5. Pulled 3 men out of water that cold, brought them in. That is the whole of what I have ever said out loud about it. And until that night, it had always felt like enough. What I have never said to Derek, or to anyone else, is what that water actually felt like closing over my own boots for the length of time it took to get a rope under the third man's arms, or what I told myself in the seconds I genuinely believed I was not going to make it back to the launch with him. I have carried that part alone for 37 years, the same way I carried this clock wrapped up and put away, taken out only when I could stand to look at it for a few minutes at a time. I sat with the clock for a long time before I touched anything else on the bench. Then I got out my case of jeweler's screwdrivers, the small ones I use for the fine work on the anemometer. And I started at the housing, working the corroded screws loose one at a time, patient the way you have to be patient with anything that has been sealed shut for 37 years and does not want to open easily. By the time Nell came out to the shed with 2 cups of coffee, it was nearly 9 the next morning, and I had not gone to bed at all. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she said anything, the way she does when she wants to take in a scene fully before she steps into it. The clock's housing was open on the bench, its brass gears laid out in a careful row on a clean rag. Each one cleaned of decades of salt corrosion with a toothbrush and a dish of vinegar I had mixed sometime around 3 in the morning. "You didn't sleep," she said. It was not a question. No. She set 1 cup of coffee down on the corner of the bench where I could reach it without looking up, and she stood beside me, studying the parts laid out in their row. "What is it going to be?" she asked. "A gift," I said. "For the wedding." Nell was quiet for a moment. She knew the clock. She had known it as long as I had seen me take it out and put it away a dozen times over the years, without ever once seeing me touch a tool to it. "Condition 11, she said finally. "No handmade gifts." "I know what it says. They'll know it's from you the moment they see it." "I'm counting on that," I said, and I picked up the mainspring, holding it to the light to check it for cracks before I set it back down. "I'm not fixing this to hide who made it, Nell. I'm fixing it so there's no arguing about who made it when the time comes." She did not ask me what I meant by that, not yet, though I could see the question forming behind her eyes, even as she let it go unspoken for the moment. She picked up her own coffee and stood beside me at the bench, watching the light catch the row of cleaned brass gears, quiet in the particular way she gets when she has decided that whatever I am building it for a reason good enough that she does not need to understand it yet to trust it. "It's beautiful work," she said after a while. "Even broken like this, it'll be more beautiful put back together." I picked up the next screw, set it into place, and held it there with one finger while I reached for the driver. "Everything is, if you're patient enough to do it right." I worked through most of that day and into the evening, stopping only when my hip forced the issue, and Nell brought me sandwiches at noon and coffee again around 4. Not asking further questions, simply setting each one down within reach and going back inside to whatever she had been doing before I called her out to the workshop the night before. By the time the light through the small, high window had gone from afternoon gold to the flat gray that comes before dusk in October, I had the housing cleaned, the gear train freed and oiled, and the cracked glass face set aside on the bench to be replaced with a new one I would need to order from a specialty shop in Milwaukee, the only place within 200 miles that still cut glass to fit an instrument this old. I did not call Derek that day to tell him we would be coming. I was not ready yet to say the words out loud that I already knew I was going to have to say into that phone, the ones agreeing to every single condition on his list, delivered in a voice calm enough that he would never guess what I was building 40 miles from where he slept. That night, after Nell had gone up to bed, I sat alone in the shed a while longer, with the mainspring in my palm, turning it slowly under the work light, thinking about how a thing this small had once meant the difference between a storm and a story you tell your grandchildren someday. It had taken 3 men off that boat and put them back on dry land breathing. It seemed a small enough thing to ask of it now, that it tell one honest thing at a wedding where everyone else in the room had apparently agreed to tell only the version that was convenient. I wrapped the parts loosely in the clean rag, left them in order on the bench, where I would find them again in the morning, and turned off the work light. Through the small, high window, the automated beacon that had replaced the light I once tended by hand swept its pale arc across the dark water one more time before I closed the shed door behind me. The new glass arrived from Milwaukee on a Wednesday, cut to the exact bevel of the original, and I fitted it into the brass housing that same afternoon with a patience I did not entirely feel, but forced myself into anyway, because rushing the last piece of a repair this old struck me as its own kind of disrespect. The shop that cut it was run by a man in his 80s who had spent his career fitting glass for ship's instruments before the work mostly disappeared, and when I explained over the phone what the piece was for, he did not ask a single question about the wedding or the family or any of the 20 conditions I had not mentioned to him. He asked only what year the boat had gone down and whether the original bevel had survived. And when I told him, he said that kind of glass deserved to be cut right the first time, and he would have it ready in 9 days. It took the better part of 2 weeks, working most evenings after Nell had gone to bed, to bring that clock back to something resembling what it must have looked like the day it was mounted on a boat none of us had ever known the name of. I replaced the mainspring with one ordered special from a horological supply house in Chicago, since the original had corroded past saving. I reblued the second hand by hand, heating it slowly over a small flame, until the steel took on that particular deep color old maritime instruments carry, and I polished the brass housing until it held a shine I had not seen on it since long before it went into the water. By the second Tuesday, the clock ran. I wound it that evening, set the hands to the correct time for the first occasion in 37 years, and stood over it at the workbench, listening to it tick. A small, even sound. Nothing dramatic about it, and yet I stood there longer than the moment strictly required. The way you do when something you assumed was permanently broken turns out with enough patience not to have been. I called Derek the following evening. He picked up on the second ring, the particular clipped tone he uses when he is between patients or between meetings. A voice built for efficiency, rather than warmth. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I wanted to let you and Whitney know your mother and I received the letter. We'll be there on the 14th. We'll follow the conditions as written, and we'll be at table 19 as instructed." There was a pause on his end longer than the sentence should have required. "You read all 20?" he said finally, and something in his voice, some small flicker underneath the professional evenness, told me he had been bracing for a different call than the one he was getting. "I read all 20, I said. "We'll follow them." "Just like that." "Just like that," I said. "Is there anything else you need from us before the 14th? Another pause, shorter this time. "No," he said. "That's it. Thank you for calling, Dad." Somewhere behind him, I could hear the particular hum of a hospital corridor, a page over an intercom, too distorted to make out the sound of a life that moved fast enough that a phone call from his father had to fit into whatever gap happened to be open. Of course. I let the silence sit for a beat longer than the conversation needed. The way I used to let silence sit on the radio when a captain needed a second to say something he was not sure he wanted logged. Derek did not fill it. Whatever he might have said into that gap if he had one, stayed where it was, and after a moment I said, "We'll see you Saturday." And he said the same back, and the call ended the way most of our calls end now, complete on the surface and unfinished everywhere underneath it. I set the phone down on the workbench next to the clock. Nell had come out to the shed partway through the call, standing in the doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder, the way she does most evenings, and she had heard enough of it to understand what I had just agreed to. "You told him yes," she said. It was not quite a question and not quite an accusation, something in between the tone of a woman checking a decision she already suspects she disagrees with. "I told him we'd follow the conditions. All 20. All 20. I picked up a soft cloth and ran it once more over the brass housing, more out of habit at that point than necessity, since the clock had not needed cleaning in days. "I'm not going to stand in that room and argue with our son about a seating chart, Nell. That's not the fight worth having, and it was never going to change anything if I tried." She crossed the shed slowly and stood beside me at the bench, looking down at the clock, its hands now moving steadily toward the correct hour for the first time in nearly 4 decades. "So you're just going to let it happen? The table, the suit he wants us to wear, all of it?" "I'm going to let it happen," I said. "Because none of that is the part that matters." I closed the small access panel on the back of the housing and set the last screw into place, tightening it slow, deliberate. The same care I had given every piece of that clock since I first opened it. "The part that matters is going to be sitting on the gift table when they open it, and there won't be a single condition on that list that can stop them from seeing exactly what it is." Nell was quiet for a long moment, watching my hands finish the last of the work. And when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something closer to understanding, though not yet all the way to agreement. "You're going to let the clock say what you won't?" she said. I did not answer that directly. I picked the clock up, weighed it once in both hands, the way you weigh anything you have spent weeks putting back together, checking, without meaning to, whether it feels as solid as it looks. It did. I set it back down on the bench, gently, face up, hands ticking forward. "I've spent my whole life saying things with my hands instead of my mouth," I said. "No reason to stop now on account of a seating chart." Nell almost smiled at that. The first real movement toward one I had seen on her face in days, though it did not fully arrive. She reached out and touched the edge of the housing lightly. The way you touch something you have decided to trust, even before you fully understand the plan behind it. "All right, Marcus," she said. "Then we'll do it your way." She paused at the workshop door on her way back inside, one hand on the frame. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "That when the moment comes, whatever that moment turns out to be, you'll let me stand right next to you for it. I've had enough of finding things out secondhand, from a hallway or a garage doorway. I'd like to be standing there when it happens, not hearing about it after." I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had spent 18 years writing letters she never sent, and 4 years selling pieces of her own history to keep our son afloat, without once asking for credit. And I understood that this was not a small request, whatever plainness she had wrapped it in. "You'll be standing right there," I said. "I wouldn't have it any other way." She nodded, once satisfied, and went back into the house, leaving me alone in the shed with the clock ticking steadily toward a Saturday neither of us could yet picture clearly. Though I suspect we had both begun in our separate and quiet ways to imagine what it might sound like when that ticking finally reached the room it was built for. Odell and Marlene showed up at our door on the Tuesday before the wedding with a small suitcase between them, and before either of us could ask a single question about it, Marlene set it down on the porch and said, "We're coming Saturday. That's settled. We only stopped by so you could tell us what time to be ready." I stood in the doorway for a moment without answering because I had not expected this. Not from either of them, and not with a suitcase already packed. "Nobody invited you," I said, which was true, and which was also, judging by the look on Marlene's face, entirely beside the point as far as she was concerned. "Nobody invited half the people who ought to be standing in that room," she said. "Derek didn't invite the truth either, and it's coming anyway." Behind her, Odell shifted the suitcase slightly with his foot the way a man does when he wants to be part of a conversation without saying anything further to complicate it. Nell had come up beside me by then, drying her hands on a towel she did not need to dry them on, and she looked at Marlene for a long moment before she spoke. "You bought a dress," Nell said. It was not quite a question. "I bought a dress," Marlene confirmed. "Burgundy. Saturday morning at the shop on 3rd Street, and the woman who sold it to me asked what occasion, and I told her a wedding, and she asked whose, and I said, well, that depends on how you look at it." I laughed once short, more surprise than humor, and it was the first time I had laughed at anything in nearly 3 weeks. "You're serious." "I have been serious about very little else this month," Marlene said. "But I am serious about this. 40 years across the road from you both. I have watched that boy grow up, watched you build half of what he ever owned, with your own 2 hands. And I am not going to sit at home Saturday afternoon pretending I don't know what's happening 130 miles south of here." Odell had not said much yet, standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets, but when he finally spoke, his voice had the particular steadiness of a man who had already made his decision and was only waiting for the room to catch up to it. "We'll sit at table 19 with you," he said. "Wherever they've got you stuck, that's where we'll be. Marlene already called the venue and asked if 2 more chairs could be added to the table. They said yes, provided we didn't mind close quarters." "We don't mind close quarters," Marlene said. "We've been close quarters with each other for 43 years. A few more people at a table isn't going to trouble either of us." Nell's hand found mine without either of us deciding to reach for the other, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not entirely realized was wound tight until that moment eased. 40 years of borrowed sugar-dead car batteries in February and quiet evenings on each other's porches had built something between our 2 households that no letter with 20 conditions on it had the power to touch. And standing there on that porch, I understood for the first time just how much that mattered. I thought of all the small, unremarkable ways that friendship had accumulated over 4 decades. Odell plowing our driveway before his own, the winter I broke my wrist. Marlene sitting with Nell through 3 straight nights the year Nell's mother was dying. None of it dramatic. None of it the kind of thing you'd think to write down in a letter, and yet all of it taken together, weighing more than anything printed on Derek's 20 conditions. "Thank you," I said, and it came out rougher than I intended. "Don't thank us yet," Odell said. "Save it for Saturday." Theo Reyes came by that same evening, a little after 7, still in his field boots from the research station. Mud dried along the seams, the way it always was this time of year, a canvas satchel of water sampling gear still slung over one shoulder. From a day out on the peninsula. He had heard from Odell, apparently, that something was in motion, and he did not waste time getting to why he had come. "I got the invitation through the Callaway side," he told me, standing in the kitchen doorway. "Roland's company funded part of our wetlands survey last year, and somehow that landed Priya and me on the guest list. I wasn't going to go, honestly. Weddings for people I've never met aren't usually my idea of a good Saturday. But Odell mentioned you needed someone on the inside who could get something onto the gift table without anyone asking too many questions beforehand. I need someone I trust, I said. That's all it is. Theo nodded slowly, looking past me toward the workbench where the clock sat finished now, wrapped again in a fresh length of oilcloth, waiting. Can I see it? I brought it over and unwrapped it for him, and he was quiet for a long moment, studying the brass housing, the newly cut glass, catching the kitchen light. The second hand sweeping steady and sure across a face that had not moved in 37 years before I touched it. This is beautiful work, Marcus, he said finally. Thank you. I'll carry it in as part of our gift contribution, he said. Set it on the table with the rest before the ceremony starts. Nobody's going to think twice about a guest carrying a box to a gift table. It'll already be in the room by the time anybody thinks to ask where it came from. That's the idea, I said. He looked at me for a moment, something careful in his expression. The look of a younger man, weighing whether the older one across from him had fully thought through what he was setting in motion. You're sure you don't want to tell Derek beforehand? Give him some warning, so it's not a shock in front of 200 people? I thought about that question longer than it probably deserved, standing there in my own kitchen, with the clock between us ticking quietly patient, the way it had been patient in a drawer for 37 years, waiting for someone to finally open it. No, I said. He's had every warning I know how to give him for the last 3 weeks, and none of it landed the way I hoped it would. This time I want him to see it. Not hear about it secondhand, not get a phone call warning him first. I want him standing in that room when it happens, the same as everyone else. Theo nodded, slowly accepting that, and wrapped the clock back up in its oilcloth with a care I appreciated more than I said out loud. Saturday, then, he said. I'll take good care of it until it's exactly where it needs to be. I know you will, I said. And I meant it. The same plain certainty I had felt watching Odell and Marlene stand on my porch, with a suitcase already packed for a wedding no one had asked them to attend. After Theo left, I stood alone in the kitchen for a while, the clock back in its oilcloth on the counter, and I thought about how strange it was that the people who had shown up hardest for us over the last 3 weeks were not the people connected to us by blood, but the people who had simply chosen, year after year, to stay close enough to notice when something was wrong. Blood, I had always assumed growing up, was the thing that guaranteed a person would show up for you. I was 69 years old and only now beginning to understand that showing up was never guaranteed by anything except the choosing itself made new every single day. 2 people happened to live across a road from one another and decided the distance was worth closing. Nell came in from the other room and found me still standing there, one hand resting on the wrapped clock. And she did not ask what I was thinking. She simply stood beside me at the counter, the way she had stood beside me at the workbench for 2 weeks straight, and let the quiet hold both of us until it was time to think about supper. I went looking for a lighthouse maintenance log on Thursday morning, 3 days before the wedding, and found something else instead that put me on the floor of the workshop for the better part of an hour. I needed the log because I wanted to confirm the exact date of the storm for the small card I intended to leave with the clock, and the station records from those years were stored in a metal filing cabinet I had bought second-hand from the decommissioned Coast Guard office in the mid-90s. The same cabinet that had followed me from the station to the garage to this shed over 3 decades of moves. Its drawers stuck in humid weather, and its green paint had worn through to bare metal at the corners, where 2 generations of keepers before me had dragged it across concrete floors. And I had never once considered replacing it, the way you don't replace a thing that has simply always been there. I opened the bottom drawer, the one I rarely touched, full of yellowed folders, organized by year, in a system only I still remembered the logic of, and worked my way back to October of 1987. The maintenance log was there, exactly where it should have been. Water-stained along one edge, but legible, but tucked behind it, folded into quarters and gone soft and brown at the creases, was a newspaper clipping I did not remember keeping. I unfolded it carefully. The paper had the particular fragility of something that had spent decades in the dark, and I handled it the way you handle anything that old slow, both hands aware that a careless movement could tear it beyond repair. It was a single column from the Door County Advocate, dated 3 days after the storm, 4 short paragraphs under a small headline. Local keeper credited in lake rescue. I read it standing up, then sat down on the workshop stool to read it again, the stool legs scraping once against the concrete floor in the quiet. Because something in the second paragraph had caught wrong in my chest, the way a hook catches on cloth instead of skin. Not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore. The article said I had rescued 3 men from a capsized pleasure cruiser during the October storm. It gave the boat's registration number. It quoted the harbor master thanking me for my quick action. And then, in the 4th paragraph in language so brief it had clearly been written by someone working against a deadline with incomplete information, it said the 3 men had been transported to Sturgeon Bay Memorial Hospital for treatment and were expected to recover, and it did not name a single one of them. I sat with that clipping in my hands for a long time. I want to explain something now that I did not explain to Nell that morning. Something I have carried privately since I was 12 years old and stood at my own father's funeral, being told in no uncertain terms that a man on this water does not have the luxury of falling apart in front of other people. My father drowned in a squall 3 miles off this same point when I was 12. I was not there. I have spent every year since then, every single one, quietly terrified of the particular arithmetic of a man in cold water. Terrified that when the moment actually came, when it was my turn to be the one standing between someone and that water, I would freeze, or miscount, or simply not be enough. I had always believed I passed that test in 1987. I had told the story enough times in the plain, factual language I allow myself for it, that the telling itself had become a kind of proof. 3 men. I pulled 3 men from that water, and I brought all 3 of them back. But sitting there, with that clipping in my hands, I realized I had never once in 37 years seen it confirmed anywhere outside my own memory. No official commendation with names attached, no follow-up story checking on their recovery, no family that had ever reached out afterward to say thank you, which had never struck me as strange until this exact moment, holding 4 paragraphs that could not even be bothered to name the men whose lives had supposedly been saved. What if there had been a 4th man that night, and I had missed him in the dark, in the noise, in the cold, and simply never known it because no one alive was left to tell me otherwise? It is not a rational fear. I want to say that plainly because I have had 3 days now to turn it over and examine it from every angle, and I know it does not hold up cleanly against what I remember of that night. The exact count I gave the harbor master before I was even fully out of the water myself. Still shaking. Still certain of the number 3 because I had counted it out loud to myself the entire time I worked. But knowing a fear is not rational has never once in my experience made it easier to set down. My father's death had no witnesses who lived to describe it clearly. Mine had one witness, and that witness was me. And for the first time in 37 years, I found myself wondering whether a tired, frightened, 12-year-old boy's need to prove himself worthy of a different outcome had quietly written itself into the story an adult man told for the rest of his life. I folded the clipping back along its original creases, careful not to add a new one, and I put it in the breast pocket of my flannel shirt instead of back in the folder. I did not tell Nell what I had found. Not that morning, and not in the days that followed. I want to be honest about why, since honesty seems to be the entire business of this story now. It was not that I did not trust her with it. It was that I did not yet trust myself with saying it out loud. Not until I had some way of knowing for certain whether the man I had spent 37 years believing myself to be was the man the water had actually left behind that night. She called me in for dinner around 6, and I folded the maintenance log back into its place in the cabinet, closed the drawer, and walked into the house with the clipping still folded against my chest, saying nothing about it the way I have said nothing about the parts of that night that never made it into the 4 paragraphs a newspaper editor decided were worth printing. We ate at the kitchen table the way we had eaten 1,000 suppers before it. Meatloaf and green beans from the garden freezer, the radio playing low on the counter the way it always does. And if Nell noticed that I was quieter than usual, she did not press it, which was its own kind of mercy. I did not deserve and received anyway. I answered her when she spoke to me. I asked reasonable questions about what she needed to pack for Saturday. I did all the things a man does when he wants the surface of an evening to look ordinary while something underneath it has come loose and is drifting slow and cold toward a shore he cannot yet see. Twice during that meal, my hand went to my shirt pocket, without my permission, checking that the clipping was still there. The way you check a wound is still closed even after the doctor has told you it will hold. Both times Nell's eyes followed the movement, and both times she said nothing, only watched, filing it away, the same patient way she had filed away 18 years of letters she never sent, waiting for the moment I would be ready to hand her whatever it was I was carrying now. We left Northport before 6 on Saturday morning, the sky still more black than gray. Nell's travel mug in the cup holder, and mine, the one with the chipped handle, riding in my left hand while I steered with the right. The garment bags with our suits hung from the hook behind the back seat, swaying gently with every curve in the road, and the oak box sat wrapped and secured in a padded crate on the floor behind Nell's seat, riding as carefully as a piece of luggage ever had in that truck. The drive down to Lake Forest runs the better part of the peninsula and half the length of the state below it. 5 hours if the roads cooperate, and for the first hour neither of us said much of anything. Nell watched the dark fields along the highway turn slowly to the pale gray that comes before actual light, and I kept the truck at a steady 65, the radio off, just the sound of tires on pavement, and the heater working a low hum under the dash. A pair of deer crossed well ahead of us near the county line, unhurried, and I slowed without needing to brake, watching them clear the shoulder before I brought the truck back up to speed. Somewhere past Manitowoc, with the sun finally up and the lake occasionally visible off to our left through gaps in the tree line, Nell spoke without turning her head from the window. "Do you think he'll look at us?" she said, "when we walk in?" "I don't know," I said, because it was the truth, and because after 41 years she had earned better from me than a comfortable lie dressed up as reassurance. She was quiet again for a while after that, turning her coffee mug slowly in both hands, the way she does when she is working through something she is not ready to say out loud yet. My own hand drifted twice to my shirt pocket, checking the clipping was still there beneath my jacket, and both times I caught myself doing it and made myself stop, hands back on the wheel, eyes back on the road. We stopped a little before 9 at a diner outside Manitowoc that Nell remembered from a trip decades back. The kind of place with a chalkboard specials sign and a waitress who called both of us Hun without seeming to notice she'd done it. We ordered eggs and split a plate of hash browns, and for 20 minutes, sitting across from each other in a cracked vinyl booth, neither of us mentioned the wedding at all. Nell told me a story about her sister's garden I had heard before and let her tell it again anyway, because some mornings a familiar story is exactly what a table needs. The coffee was strong and a little burnt at the bottom of the pot, the way diner coffee always is by mid-morning, and outside the window a man in a hunting jacket loaded firewood into the bed of an old pickup, unhurried, in no more of a rush than we were. Back on the highway, the miles started to feel different somehow. Not shorter exactly, but steadier, the way a long job feels once you've found your rhythm in it. Nell fell asleep for the better part of an hour somewhere south of Milwaukee, her head tipped against the window, and I let her sleep, keeping the truck quiet, the wipers off, though a light rain had started since the visibility was fine, and the sound of them would have woken her. I watched the wipers' absence with a strange, small satisfaction, the way a man notices the machinery of a decision no one else will ever know he made. An hour of borrowed quiet given to someone who had spent 18 years giving quiet to everyone else first. I let my mind wander in that hour, the way it does on a long stretch of highway with nothing to do but hold a wheel steady. I thought about the clock riding in its crate behind us, wrapped carefully enough to survive worse roads than this one. I thought about the clipping still folded in my breast pocket beneath my jacket, and about the particular arithmetic I still had not resolved in my own head. 3 men. Always 3, no matter how many times I turned the number over looking for a crack in it. Outside the window, the flat farmland gave way slowly to something greener and more managed. Hedgerows instead of fence lines, the unmistakable geography of money that had been sitting in one place for a long time. When she stirred again, we were close enough to Chicago that the highway had widened into something busier, more lanes, more noise. The flat farmland replaced by the outer edges of a city neither of us had much reason to visit anymore. She sat up slowly, rubbing one eye with the heel of her hand. How long was I out? Hour or so? She looked out at the changing landscape, taking it in, and reached over to rest her hand on my forearm. Light just resting there. Thank you for letting me sleep. You needed it. We both did, she said. Though I notice you didn't take any of it yourself. I did not have a good answer for that, so I did not try to give her one. The exit for Lake Forest came up a little after 1 in the afternoon, and I took it slow, following the directions Derek had sent weeks earlier, the route curving off the highway into streets that got progressively wider and greener the closer we came to the venue. Old trees, old money. The particular hush of a neighborhood built to keep the rest of the world at a respectful distance. The motel where we had a room booked sat a few miles short of the venue itself. Plain and clean, the kind of place that did not pretend to be anything it was not. We checked in a little after 2, carried our 2 bags up to a second-floor room facing the parking lot, and Nell sat down on the edge of the bed, while I set the garment bag with our suits across the second one, careful not to crush the jacket. Big day tomorrow, I said, which was not true since the wedding was that same evening. But Nell understood what I meant well enough not to correct me. Through the thin motel curtains, the parking lot lights were already coming on against the gray afternoon. And somewhere down the row, a car door closed, unhurried, someone else arriving for the same evening we were. She leaned her head against my shoulder without saying anything further, and we sat there together on the edge of that motel bed for a while, listening to the muffled sound of traffic through the wall, neither of us in any hurry to be the one who broke the quiet first. I could feel her breathing slow and even against my shoulder, and I let my own hand rest lightly on her knee. No words needed for either of us in that particular stretch of afternoon. Just the two of us and a room full of ordinary motel quiet before everything on the other side of it began. Ravinia Manor sat at the end of a curved drive lined with lit lanterns, a restored stone building with tall windows glowing gold from the inside. The kind of place built by people who never had to ask what something cost. A valet in a red jacket took the truck before I could even mention the crate riding behind the back seat, and another young man in matching livery lifted it out with more care than I expected, carrying it toward the venue entrance ahead of us, as though he somehow already understood it mattered. I watched it go, the crate held level and steady against his chest, and felt something in me settle just slightly. The way you settle once you've handed off a piece of work you trust into hands that will treat it right. We walked in through the main doors a little after 4. Odell and Marlene a step behind us. Marlene's burgundy dress catching the light from the chandeliers overhead. Odell in the same charcoal suit he had worn to his own daughter's college graduation years back, pressed and brushed for the occasion. A reception table just inside the entrance held 2 women checking names against a tablet. And when I gave ours, the one on the left ran her finger down the screen and said, with practice brightness, "Mr. and Mrs. Voss, you're at table 19 through the main doors and to your left." I thanked her. Nell took my arm. The ballroom opened up in front of us the way a room does when a great deal of money has been spent making sure it would. White orchids climbed from tall arrangements at the center of every table. Candles burned in glass hurricanes down the length of the room, and a monogram D and W interlocked in gold script glowed on a screen behind a raised platform at the far end. The ceiling was coffered plaster painted the color of fresh cream, and chandeliers hung at intervals catching the candlelight and scattering it warmer and more expensive looking across every surface than it had any right to be. 200 guests easily, already seated or moving between tables, the low murmur of people who did not yet know each other well enough to be loud. Somewhere behind us, quiet quickly covered, someone laughed. A short, sharp sound, swallowed almost as soon as it escaped. I did not turn to look. I had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do when someone laughs at you in a room like this is let them see that you heard it. So I kept walking, my left hip doing what it always does on long walks across hard floors, and I let the sound happen behind me, in whatever corner it had come from. Nell's grip on my arm tightened by exactly 1 degree. She had heard it too. Table 19 sat along the left wall, close enough to the kitchen doors that the sound of rolling carts carried clearly every time they swung open. Odell pulled out a chair for Marlene. I held Nell's. 2 extra place settings had been added at the far end for our neighbors, exactly as Marlene had arranged over the phone, and the 5 of us settled in at a table built for 8 tucked at the edge of a room full of people who had, by someone's calculation, decided our worth in advance. The white linen was the same as every other table in that room. The candle in its glass hurricane matched the ones burning at the head of the platform, same size, same warm flicker. That detail struck me for a moment, as almost funny. The particular kind of funny that has no laugh anywhere near it. "View's not bad from here," Odell said, looking around, taking in the sweep of the room, without any bitterness in his voice, only plain observation. "You can see the whole room from this angle." It was on my second look across that room that I noticed Roland Calloway. I had met him only once before, briefly, at an engagement dinner in Milwaukee the previous spring. A broad man with silver hair and the particular ease of someone who had been comfortable for so long he had stopped noticing it. Tonight, he stood near a marble fountain carved into a shallow basin at the center of the entrance hall. A piece shaped unmistakably like the hull and prow of an old sailing vessel, water spilling gently from a raised bow. Every other guest who passed it slowed down, admired it, took a photograph, phones angled to catch the candlelight on the moving water. Roland walked past it without once turning his head, his jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with the woman beside him or the conversation she was having. His eyes fixed forward, as though the fountain simply did not exist in whatever version of the room he had decided to see. I watched him do it twice more over the following 20 minutes. Each time the same, a wide, deliberate arc around that stretch of marble, never once glancing at the water, and each time something in his shoulders tightened a half-second before he adjusted his path. The way a man's body flinches from a memory faster than his mind can catch up, and disguise it as something else. I did not know standing at table 19 with my wife's hand in mine what that meant. I only knew the way you know a beam is going to crack before it actually does, from some accumulation of small signs your hands have learned to read faster than your mind can explain them, that it meant something. The string quartet near the platform began to tune 4 musicians in black positioned near a bank of white orchids, drawing a few opening notes out of the murmur of the room. The murmur dropped away in layers, table by table, the particular quiet of several hundred people agreeing all at once to pay attention. Somewhere near the far side of the room, a server lit the last of the candles that had gone out, cupping the flame briefly against a draft from the main doors, before moving on to the next table. "It's starting," Nell said quietly, and reached for my hand under the table. I took it, and I looked once more toward the fountain shaped like the bow of a boat, water still spilling gently over stone, and toward the spot where Roland Calloway had been standing minutes before, now gone, folded somewhere into the crowd gathering near the platform for the ceremony about to begin. The ceremony began exactly on time. A man in his 50s, with the measured voice of someone accustomed to performing in large rooms, took his position on the platform and welcomed the guests with the standard language of weddings, love and commitment, and the significance of witnesses' words I had heard versions of at half a dozen ceremonies over the years, and had never once before found strange in my own mouth. To sit through, the groomsmen filed in from a side door in matching charcoal suits. I recognized Preston Ashcombe among them by the particular looseness in his walk, a man convinced his presence in a room was itself a form of importance. He took his position near the front without glancing toward table 19. Then Derek walked out. I had not seen my son in his wedding suit before that moment. He was tall, straight-backed the way I have always stood, and in the black suit with the ivory tie Whitney had apparently selected for him, he looked like exactly the kind of man people assume is successful, without needing to ask for evidence. He was 36 years old, and he was someone I had loved without condition for every one of those years. And standing there at the front of that ballroom, he looked for just a moment almost completely like a stranger. I found myself searching his face for some trace of the boy who used to sit cross-legged on our kitchen floor, asking questions about wind and tide, and for a moment, I could not find him there at all, buried somewhere under the posture and the tailoring and the careful arrangement of his own expression. His eyes moved across the assembled guests with the practiced survey of a man who had been told exactly where everyone would be seated. When his gaze reached the left wall, it found table 19. It found me. For 2 seconds, we looked at each other across the length of that room. Then he looked away. Nell's hand found mine under the table. Her fingers were cold. I held them, and I did not look away myself, not yet, watching my son's eyes continue their survey of the room, as though table 19 had contained nothing worth pausing on. The bridesmaids came next, then a flower girl of about 6, scattering petals with the intense concentration of someone performing surgery. The music shifted to the processional, and every head in the room turned toward the back doors. Whitney came in on her father's arm. I will say this plainly because it is simply true. She was a beautiful bride. The dress was simple and well-fitted, the kind that required a particular confidence to wear well. And Roland walked beside her with the expression of a man entirely aware that every eye in the room was on him by proximity, and did not seem to mind it at all. Beneath that easy public composure, though, I noticed something I had not expected to notice. A stiffness in the set of his shoulders that had nothing to do with the occasion. The same stiffness I had watched him carry past the fountain twice already that evening. He delivered her to the front with a kiss on the cheek and returned to his seat at table 1, where Diane reached over and gripped his arm. The ceremony itself did not run long. The officiant spoke about partnership and building a life together. Derek and Whitney had written their own vows, reading them from small cards. Whitney's were polished, assured, clearly rehearsed. Derek's surprised me. He spoke about wanting to be the kind of man who showed up, who stayed present, who did not leave when things became difficult. I sat at table 19 and listened to my son say those words. And I felt something press against the inside of my chest that had no clean name for it. Beside me, Odell exhaled slowly through his nose. Marlene reached over and set her hand briefly on top of Nell's. When the rings were exchanged and the officiant pronounced them married, the room responded with the warm, collective sound of a few hundred people who were either genuinely moved or performing being moved. And it is not always easy in a room like that to tell the difference. I clapped along with everyone else. Nell clapped beside me, her eyes bright, and for just a moment, watching my son kiss his new wife, I let myself set aside everything sitting in my breast pocket and everything sitting on that gift table, and simply be for the length of one held breath, a father watching his boy get married. The couple turned to face their guests, and Derek's eyes swept the room again with that same surveying look. This time when he reached table 19, he did not stop. His gaze moved past us and continued around the room, as though we contained nothing worth pausing on a second time. The music swelled. They began their recessional walk, and as they passed close enough that I could see the small pearl buttons on Whitney's sleeve, she turned her head toward the room to acknowledge the applause, her eyes sweeping the left wall with the mechanical pleasantness of a smile prepared well in advance. She did not look at Nell. She did not look at me. She looked through us, the way you look through a window at something more interesting happening on the other side of it. Nell's hand had gone very still in mine. The room broke into the general motion of guests, rising, stretching, drifting toward the bar, chairs scraping softly against the polished floor. Servers appeared with trays of champagne, moving between tables with practiced ease. A man in his 40s took the microphone with the same practiced ease and announced that dinner would be served shortly, and that before dinner, the couple would be honored by a special gift presentation, personally arranged by the bride, and was, he said smiling, going to be memorable. I looked across the room toward the gift table. The oak box sat at the end of the row, exactly where Theo had placed it, the carved inscription on its lid catching the light from the nearest chandelier. It looked smaller than I remembered it, tucked in among the crystal and the wrapped boxes and the embossed envelopes surrounding it. And yet, somehow, it also seemed to hold the light differently than everything around it, the way real wood always does among glass and paper. Marcus, I told myself, Do not stare at it. Let it wait its turn. My left hand, the one not holding Nell's, rested flat against my thigh, against the leg that had ached all evening the way it always does on long days. And I waited for whatever was coming, watching the servers begin to circulate through the room with the particular unhurried efficiency of people who had done this exact job at 100 other weddings just like it, and would do it again at 100 more. The gift presentation began with items from Whitney's side of the family. Diane's sister and her husband, up from Charlotte for the weekend, presented a check in an embossed envelope that Roland announced to the room with evident satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of a man reading a number he approved of. Two of Whitney's cousins brought framed photographs, black and white portraits of the couple, taken at some engagement session months earlier. An aunt on the Calloway side gave a set of monogrammed crystal glasses, carried to the platform with both hands, like something ceremonial, catching murmurs of appreciation from the nearest tables. Each gift produced applause. Each applause produced a photograph, phones raised in unison around the room. The MC narrated it all with the cheerful efficiency of a man being paid by the hour, moving the room briskly from one gift to the next. Then a server lifted the oak box. I felt Odell shift in his seat beside me. Under the table, Nell pressed her knee against mine. The server carried the box to the platform with both hands and set it down in front of Derek and Whitney. And I watched from 100 feet away the exact moment my son understood what he was looking at. The quarter-sawn oak. The hand-cut dovetails at the corners, the brass hinges, the small brass clasp, the carved inscription across the lid. His jaw tightened by exactly 1 degree, the same small tightening I had watched on his face 1,000 times as a boy, right before he was about to say something he had not fully thought through. Whitney looked at the box, then at Derek, a question forming behind her eyes. Derek said something to her quietly, too low for the room to catch, and whatever it was made her expression go careful and flat. The look of someone deciding how to respond to something unexpected in public. The MC leaned toward the box and read the small card Theo had attached to the lid. "This gift comes from Marcus and Eleanor Voss," he announced, straightening, smiling at the room. Applause moved through the guests. Polite, scattered, the sound of people clapping for a name that meant nothing to most of them. Derek's hands found the brass clasp. "Derek, maybe we open this one privately," Whitney said, her voice pitched low, using his name the way she always used it in public, careful and proprietary at once. But Derek had already lifted the lid. On top sat the folded note I had written weeks earlier, 7 lines in my plainest handwriting. He picked it up, unfolded it, and read it. I could not see his face from table 19, but I could see his shoulders, and I watched them change as he read. A barely perceptible shift, a slight drop like something had let go of tension he had been carrying since the moment he walked into that room. He set the note down without reading it aloud and reached into the box. He lifted the clock out with both hands. Even from that distance, the brass caught the chandelier light the way I had hoped it would, the newly cut glass throwing a small, bright reflection across the platform floor. A few nearby tables had gone quiet, guests turning to see what had drawn Derek's full attention away from the rest of the presentation. Derek held it, turning it slowly, and I watched him take in the housing, the second hand sweeping steady across a face that had not moved in 37 years, before I touched it. That was when Roland Calloway stood up from table 1. He had been sitting near the platform the entire evening, close enough to see everything clearly, and something about the clock had drawn him forward the way a certain kind of sound draws a man's head around before he has consciously decided to turn it. He climbed the 2 low steps to the platform without waiting to be invited, the particular unbothered confidence of a man who assumes doors open for him because they always have. Diane half rose from her seat as if to follow him, but then sat back down, watching her husband's back with an expression I could not quite read from that distance. "May I?" he said, already reaching for it, his hand extended before Derek had fully offered it to him. Derek did not stop him. I am not sure in that moment that he could have. Roland took the clock in both hands, turning it over slowly, studying the brass housing with the focused attention of a man who had spent decades around ships and knew exactly what he was looking at. The room's attention had begun to drift back toward its own conversations by then. most guests assuming this was simply an admiring father-in-law examining a well-made gift, nothing more. He ran one thumb along the edge of the base, and then he tilted it, catching the light at a different angle, and went very still. I knew watching him from across the room precisely what he had found. There was a small mark stamped into the underside of every marine chronometer built by the company that made this one. A maker's serial number. And beneath it, on this particular clock, an owner's registration etched by hand decades ago by whoever had commissioned it. A set of numbers and a single word. That would mean nothing to anyone in that room, except a man who had once owned the boat those numbers belonged to. I had found that same etching myself, the night I first unwrapped the clock from its oilcloth after the storm, and I had left it exactly as I found it. Through every year of restoration since, never once imagining a night would come when someone across a wedding platform would recognize it faster than I could explain it. Roland's face changed. It was not a small change. It was the look of a man who has just recalculated something fundamental about the last several decades of his own life and found the original figure to be entirely wrong. He looked up from the clock across the width of that ballroom, past the platform, and past the gift table, and past 200 guests who had no idea what was happening in front of them, and his eyes found table 19. He found me. The room had not yet noticed anything was wrong. Conversations continued at half the tables, servers still moved between them with their trays. The string quartet had begun some quiet piece meant to fill the space between the gift presentation and dinner. Only a small circle of attention had gathered around the platform itself, drawn by something in Roland's posture that none of them could yet name. "Who?" Roland said, and his voice when it came had lost every trace of the easy confidence it had carried all evening. "Made this clock?" Nobody answered him right away. The MC, still holding his microphone, glanced between Roland and Derek, with the particular frozen politeness of a man whose script has just run out. His practiced smile still half in place, though it no longer had anywhere useful to go. Derek looked at his father-in-law, then at the clock still turning slowly in Roland's hands, then finally toward table 19. And I watched something cross his face that I had not seen there in 3 years. Something closer to the boy who used to ask me questions on job sites than the man who had written 20 conditions into a letter. "Roland," Diane said from table 1, half rising again. "What is it?" Roland did not look at his wife. He was still looking at me across the length of that room, the clock held now in both hands, against his chest the way you hold something you are suddenly afraid to set down. "Who made this clock?" he said again, louder this time, and the room in pieces began to notice that something had shifted. Conversations died at the tables nearest the platform first, then spread outward, the way water spreads from a stone dropped into it, table by table, until the string quartet, sensing the silence gathering around them, let their piece trail off unfinished. I stood up. I did not plan to. My body simply decided the way it sometimes does after 69 years of trusting its own instincts, more than my mind's second-guessing of them, that this was a moment for standing rather than sitting. My left hip protested the way it always does, and I let it protest without answering it, the same as I always do. Beside me, I felt Nell's hand release mine, not letting go so much as making room for the way you make room for someone who has to step forward alone, even when you would rather go with him. "I did," I said. My voice carried further than I expected it to. In a room that size, the particular effect of a ballroom built with good acoustics for exactly this kind of moment. Though I doubt whoever designed it had this scene in mind. Roland's jaw worked once before anything came out. He looked down at the clock again, then back up at me, and I watched him do the arithmetic a second time slower now, checking his own math the way you check a number you desperately want to be wrong. 22 years ago, he said, and his voice had gone rough, stripped of every trace of the polish it had carried through the entire evening. A storm off Door County, October. My boat went over about a mile from shore. I remember the water. I remember thinking I was not going to make it back to the surface a second time. I have never in my life spoken about it in this much detail out loud, not even to Diane. The room had gone entirely silent now. 200 people holding still around plates of half-finished dinner, sensing the way a crowd always senses eventually that whatever was happening on that platform mattered more than anything scheduled to happen next. Somewhere near the back, a server carrying a tray of empty champagne glasses had stopped moving entirely, caught between tables, unwilling to break the stillness with the sound of her own footsteps. 37 years, I said quietly. And something in my own voice surprised me, steadier than I expected, though not by much. It was 37 years ago, not 22. Roland's face went through something complicated, doing the math again, correcting it, and I watched an old memory rearrange itself behind his eyes in real time. 1987, he said mostly to himself. I was 26. 3 men, I said. Pulled off a capsized cruiser about a mile off the point. Water cold enough to stop a heart inside 10 minutes. Roland's hands had begun to shake just slightly. The clock still held against his chest. Diane was on her feet now, moving toward the platform, and Whitney stood frozen beside her new husband, watching her father with an expression I could not fully read from that distance, something between confusion and dawning alarm. One hand still resting on the folded note Derek had set back on the gift table minutes earlier, as though she had reached for it without deciding to, and did not yet know what to do with it now that she was holding it. "That was you," Roland said. It was not a question anymore. "The lighthouse keeper. They never told me your name. I asked in the hospital and nobody could tell me, and I told myself afterward it didn't matter, that it was better not to know. That a man doesn't need to carry around the name of the night he nearly died." "Roland?" Diane said again, reaching the base of the platform, now her voice sharper. "What are you talking about?" He did not answer her. He was still looking at me, and something in his face had begun to crumble in a way that had nothing to do with the wedding. Nothing to do with the room full of guests, now watching in absolute silence. Everything to do with a night on cold water that he had apparently spent 37 years trying very hard not to think about. "I never told anyone your name," he said. "Not my wife, not my daughter. I never even told them the whole story, not really. Just that there'd been an accident on the boat once before Whitney was born, and that I'd been lucky." His voice cracked just slightly on that last word. "I wasn't lucky. There was a man in the water with me, doing the actual work of not letting me die, and I let his name disappear because it was easier than carrying it. I told myself for years that not knowing your name meant the whole thing had happened to someone else, some other, smaller version of me, that I could set down and walk away from once the hospital released me." The clock in his hands had stopped shaking the way something does when the person holding it finally stops trying to hold something else steady at the same time. "His name is Marcus Voss," Diane said very quietly, looking not at her husband but at me, something dawning in her own face now, some connection she was only beginning to make. "Roland, that's Derek's father." Roland's eyes moved from me to Derek, to the clock in his own hands, and back to me again. And in that long, silent circuit, I watched a man discover in front of 200 wedding guests exactly whose family he had spent the evening treating like something beneath his notice. His mouth opened once, then closed, then opened again, and whatever sentence he was trying to build kept collapsing before it reached the air. "The lighthouse keeper," he said finally, so quietly I nearly missed it beneath the sound of 200 people, beginning all at once to whisper to their neighbors. "You're the same man, all this time. I sat at a table 20 feet from you tonight, and I never once looked." Derek had not moved from his spot beside Whitney, his hands empty now that the clock had left them, his eyes still fixed on me across the width of that ballroom, with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a boy, asking why oak aged better than pine in humid climates. The look of someone realizing all at once how little he had actually understood about a thing he thought he already knew completely. Roland set the clock down on the small table beside the gift display, both hands lingering on it a moment longer than necessary, the way a man holds on to something when he is not yet steady enough to let it go entirely on its own. "I need to say the rest of it," he said, still facing the room, still facing me. "If nobody objects." Nobody objected. 200 people who had come dressed for champagne and dancing sat in a silence so complete I could hear the faint hiss of the candles burning down along the head table, and somewhere far off in the kitchen, a single dropped pan clattered against tile and went instantly apologetically quiet. "There were 3 of us on that boat," Roland said. "My business partner at the time, a man named Walt Higgins who passed some years back from causes that had nothing to do with that storm, and a young man who worked crew for us that season, no more than 19. I have thought about that night exactly as little as I could manage for 37 years, and what I remember clearest, clearer than the water, clearer than the cold, is a voice counting us. Out loud, over and over, the whole time he worked the rope. 1, 2, 3. Like it mattered more than anything else in the world that the number stayed 3. He paused, his eyes distant for a moment, somewhere back on that black water. I have never told that detail to another living soul. Not the counting. I didn't have words for why it mattered so much until just now standing here, hearing you say the same number back to me without hesitating. Something loosened in my chest at that quiet private. A knot I had been carrying in my breast pocket for 11 days, finally letting go, without announcing itself to anyone in that room but me. 3. He had counted us the same way I remembered counting them out loud against the wind, because a number said aloud is a number you cannot quietly lose. I did not reach for the clipping in my pocket. I did not need to anymore. Odell stood up beside me at table 19. He was not a man built for speeches, and he did not attempt one now. He simply stood the way he had stood in doorways his whole life, plain and solid, and let the room's attention find him without asking for it. "My name is Odell Bach," he said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who had directed road crews over engine noise for 30 years and knew exactly how to make himself heard without raising his voice at all. "I have lived across the road from Marcus and Eleanor Voss for 40 years. I want to say something if nobody minds." Nobody minded. "I watched this man work double shifts at the ferry station so his boy could go to college without carrying debt into his 20s, Odell said. "I watched his wife sell pieces of jewelry that belonged to her own mother to cover what those shifts couldn't. I watched him climb a ladder onto his son's roof this past August, 69 years old, alone, because the contractor estimates were higher than he thought his son should have to pay, and I watched him come down off that roof on a stretcher." Odell's voice did not waver. It simply continued steady as a load-bearing wall. "He still walks with what that fall left behind. He walked into this room tonight carrying it same as he's carried plenty else nobody in this room bothered to ask him about. I have known this man since Nixon was in office, and in 40 years I have never once heard him complain about a single thing he's done for his family, not once, and I have decided tonight that his silence has gone on long enough without somebody in this room saying so out loud." The room had begun to turn, not dramatically, but the way a crowd turns when it is quietly rearranging what it thought it understood. Heads angling toward table 19, toward the platform, toward each other. A low murmur beginning to build beneath the silence like water finding its way under ice. "I'm not saying this to embarrass anyone," Odell continued. "I'm saying it because that man has been quiet a long time, too long, and the people who benefited from his quiet ought to know what it cost him." He sat back down. Nobody spoke for a moment. Whitney had not moved from her place beside the platform, one hand still resting on the folded note she had picked up without deciding, to her composure visibly costing her. More with each passing second, the particular strain of a mask that has begun to require active maintenance rather than simply sitting in place on its own. It was Nell of all of us who broke the silence next, standing slowly beside me, her hand finding mine again. "I wrote him letters," she said quietly enough that the room had to lean in slightly to hear it, though every word carried in that silence regardless. 18 years of them. I never sent a single one. I wasn't trying to hide anything from my son. I simply never found the moment that felt like the right one. And then 37 weeks became 37 months, became 18 years, and here we all are. She paused, And when she spoke again, her voice had softened down, no longer performing for the room at all, speaking now only to the one person it had always been meant for. I kept every one of them, Derek. I still have them at home in a tin box if you ever want to read what I couldn't say out loud. She did not say more than that. She did not need to. Derek's eyes had gone to his mother, now something breaking open in his expression that had nothing performed about it at all. His jaw working the way mine does when I am trying very hard to hold something back that has already decided it is coming out anyway. The room held that particular kind of quiet that follows something too large to respond to immediately. The hush of several hundred people absorbing more truth in the span of 10 minutes than most weddings offer in an entire evening. Somewhere near the back, a chair leg scraped softly against the floor, one small sound in an otherwise total stillness. And no one turned to see who had made it. A server stood frozen near the kitchen doors with a tray balanced on one shoulder, unwilling to interrupt whatever was happening with the ordinary business of clearing plates. I did not fill that silence either. I let it sit there the way you let a beat lie quiet after the loudest note a song has to offer. Because some things a room needs to feel all the way through before anyone asks it to feel anything else. Mel's hand tightened once around mine, and I felt more than saw Odell settle back into his chair beside us. His part said the weight of 40 years finally set down on a table where it could be seen. Nobody moved for a while. The candles along the head table had burned low enough that one of them guttered and steadied itself again. Somewhere outside, past the tall windows, a car door closed in the parking lot. Ordinary and distant. A small sound from a world that had not yet heard what this room now knew. A server near the kitchen doors finally allowed herself to shift her weight, the tray on her shoulder tilting slightly before she caught it. The string quartet's abandoned sheet music sat untouched on 4 music stands, pages fluttering faintly in whatever draft moved through the room whenever the kitchen doors swung open and shut. A single champagne cork uncorked somewhere behind me a while ago, and forgotten rolled off the edge of a table and came to rest quietly against a chair leg. And even that small sound seemed loud enough that 2 or 3 heads turned briefly toward it before turning back. Whitney was the one who finally broke it. She stepped forward to the center of the platform with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has decided the only way out of a room is straight through it, her heels sounding sharp and clear against the polished floor, in a silence that made every footstep audible. Whatever composure she had been holding on to through Roland's confession, through Odell's account, through Nell's quiet admission, had gone somewhere else now. Not shattered exactly, but absent, the way a mask goes absent once a person has finally run out of the energy required to hold it in place. "I want to say something," she announced to the room, rather than to any one person in it. Her chin lifted, her eyes moving across the tables with the same practiced sweep she had used earlier, though it had lost somewhere in the last 10 minutes all of its polish. Nobody stopped her. "Marcus and Eleanor Voss are good people," she said. The words came out clipped, forceful, the cadence of someone building a legal argument rather than offering comfort. Nobody in this room is disputing that. But there's context here that hasn't been mentioned tonight, and I think it matters. Roland, still standing near the gift table, crossed his arms. Diane watched her daughter with an expression I could only half read from that distance, something caught between dread and the focused attention of a mother who already senses her child is about to say something that cannot be taken back once it leaves the room. "Marcus has a pension," Whitney said. "Eleanor has a retirement account. They own their home outright. They are financially secure in a way that Derek and I are not. We are building everything from zero. We have a mortgage. We have his loans from residency. We have business expenses neither of you has ever had to think about the cost of a practice. The cost of malpractice insurance, the cost of simply keeping our heads above water, while everyone around us assumes we're already comfortable because Derek wears a white coat to work." Her voice had found a rhythm now, the rhythm of an argument rehearsed many times in private, only now finding daylight, each sentence arriving a little faster than the last, as though she had been holding this speech ready for months and only now found the room willing to let her deliver it. If the people who love Derek wanted to support him the way that letter claims they did, then the support worked. He's here, He's successful. He's happy. Whatever it cost accomplished exactly what it was supposed to accomplish. The room received that in a silence that had changed texture from the silence 5 minutes earlier. Thinner now, more brittle. The kind of quiet that comes not from being moved, but from being unsure what to do with what has just been said. They could afford it, Whitney said. Marcus and Eleanor could absorb those costs in a way Derek and I simply cannot. That's not gratitude. She paused, and when she finished, her voice had gone flat, finding the voice of someone laying down a number she believed settled an argument entirely. That's math. The words landed the way certain things land, not with a crash, but with the settling of a final weight coming to rest on a surface that would now have to hold it permanently. I watched several of the guests nearest the platform exchange glances, the particular look of people who have just heard something they will still be discussing on the drive home, and possibly for years after that. Diane closed her eyes. Roland uncrossed his arms and put both hands in his pockets, looking down at the floor. Between his own shoes, a man who had just watched his daughter say in front of 200 witnesses the exact sentiment he himself had spent 37 years too ashamed to speak aloud. In the opposite direction, that gratitude and debt could be confused for one another if a person worked hard enough at not looking too closely. Beside me, I felt Nell's grip on my wrist tighten hard enough that I could feel her pulse against my skin, quick and forceful. The pulse of a woman holding herself together through sheer will alone. I looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the brightness in her eyes that had not yet become tears but was close. And I thought about a woman sitting alone at a kitchen table decades ago, writing down $47 in a tin box while her husband worked an extra shift he did not know was funding the very same account. I thought about the word math. I thought too about every dollar I had ever earned that Nell had somehow invisibly redirected toward our son without asking me to notice, and about how strange it was sitting there at table 19 to hear that same devotion translated back to me now in the flat, bloodless language of a balance sheet. As though love, once it had been useful enough, could simply be filed away as a completed transaction. I did not say any of that out loud. Some things a man keeps behind his own teeth even at the worst moments, especially at the worst moments, because saying them the way they actually feel would only give the room one more thing to misunderstand. Derek had not said a single word since Roland first stood up. He stood beside his new wife on that platform, his face doing something complicated I did not have a name for, looking for the first time all evening, like a man who had not yet decided which version of himself was going to answer for what had just been said in front of 200 people. His hands hung at his sides, empty, the same hands that had held the clock only minutes earlier. And for a long moment he simply looked at Whitney, then at his mother, then finally at me, his jaw working slowly, the way mine does when a sentence is trying to form itself and cannot yet find the shape it needs. The silence stretched long enough that I began to wonder whether he intended to say anything at all. Whether this new, careful, formal version of my son had simply been built over 3 years to withstand exactly this kind of moment. By saying nothing whatsoever until it passed. Roland was the one who finally spoke into that silence. And when he did, his voice had lost every trace of the ease it had carried through the earlier part of the evening, replaced by something straighter and considerably less comfortable. "Tell me something honestly," he said, turning to face his new son-in-law directly. "When you put your parents at table 19, what was your thinking?" Derek had not moved from his position beside the gift table, and for a moment I thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, the words came out slower than his usual clipped efficiency, each one arriving like it had to be located first and then carried up from somewhere he did not often go. "It was the table that made sense for the space," he said, and I heard it too. The way the sentence came out, rehearsed a line he had prepared weeks ago and never once had to defend out loud until this exact moment. I watched the recognition land on his own face almost as soon as the words left his mouth. The particular flinch of a man who has just heard himself say something he does not fully believe. Roland looked at him for a long moment. "Is that what you want to stand behind tonight?" It made sense for the space. Derek did not answer right away. The silence stretched long enough that a few of the nearest guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, the particular discomfort of witnessing something private happening in a very public room. He looked at his father-in-law, then at his mother, who was still holding the small note I had written weeks earlier. Holding it the way she holds everything that matters, carefully with both hands. Then slowly, across the length of that ballroom, he looked at me. I did not look away. I held his gaze from table 19 in the navy suit I had chosen myself, my left hip aching the particular way it always aches by the end of a long day standing on hard floors. And I let my son look at his father and see whatever it was he needed to see. Whatever he found there, I could not tell you exactly. His face did something complicated that I did not have a clean name for. Something between shame and recognition, and the particular grief of a man realizing all at once how much he had allowed himself not to know. He did not answer Roland's question. Not in words. But something in his posture had changed the practiced straightness, gone soft at the shoulders, and I understood that whatever answer existed for him now, it was not one he was ready to say out loud in front of 200 people. And perhaps it was not one he had fully worked out for himself yet either. I decided sitting there that he did not need to. Not tonight. Not in this room in front of these particular 200 witnesses, with the wedding cake still uncut and the band still waiting for its cue to start the first dance. Some conversations deserve better than an audience, even when the audience is the reason the conversation finally started. I pushed my chair back and stood up. It was not a dramatic movement. I did not knock anything over. I simply stood the way a man stands when he has been sitting long enough and it is time to be vertical again. My hip announcing itself the way it always does, and I let it announce itself without answering back. The room noticed. Heads turned toward table 19. I did not look at Whitney. I did not look at Derek again. I looked at Nell, who was still seated beside me, her eyes coming up to find mine with a question in them. "Nell," I said, "let's go home." She held my gaze for 1 second. Then she released the edge of the table, placed both palms flat against it, and stood up beside me with the unhurried dignity of a woman who had nothing left to prove to that room, or any other room she might ever walk into again. Odell and Marlene rose at the same moment, without a word between them, without any signal passing that I could see, simply standing, because that is what you do when you have been someone's neighbor for 40 years, and the moment has arrived to walk out of a room together. Marlene reached down and straightened the hem of her burgundy dress with one hand, an ordinary, unthinking gesture that somehow made the whole moment feel steadier for having it in it. I picked up Nell's small evening bag from the back of her chair and handed it to her. She took it. I offered her my arm. She took that too. I turned toward Roland, who was still standing near the platform, his hands loose at his sides now, an expression on his face that had aged him 10 years in the last 20 minutes. "Thank you," I said, "for telling the truth about that night. I've carried it alone a long time. It's a strange kind of relief having someone else finally carry a piece of it too." I paused and found that I meant the next part just as much as the first. I hope you find some peace with it now, the way I'm hoping to find some of my own. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out at first. Then he closed it and nodded slow and deliberate, the nod of a man accepting something he had not expected to be offered, especially not from the direction it had come from. We walked toward the exit. The room did not part for us dramatically. People shifted in their chairs, turned their heads, made space the way crowds naturally do when they sense movement passing through them. A few guests near the aisle offered small, uncertain nods as we passed, unsure whether the appropriate response to what they had just witnessed was sympathy or respect or simply silence, and settling most of them on silence. The walk from table 19 to the main doors was perhaps 40 feet. My left leg did what it always does. I did not hurry, and I did not slow down. Odell's hand landed on my shoulder as we reached the door. One firm, brief pressure there, and then gone. The kind of contact that requires no explanation between two men who have known each other for 40 years. Marlene walked a half step behind Nell, close enough to catch her if the evening finally demanded more from her than she had left to give, though Nell's steps never once faltered. Behind us, I heard Whitney's voice start up again. Higher now, less controlled, and Derek saying something back to her that I could not make out. The two of them already beginning whatever conversation would define the rest of their marriage. And then the main doors closed behind the four of us, and her voice was gone, and there was only the cool October air of Lake Forest and the quiet of a residential street built to keep the rest of the world at a respectful distance, and Nell's arm in mine. We drove back to Northport in the dark, Nell asleep against the window for most of the first 2 hours. Odell and Marlene's headlights holding steady in my mirror the entire way, never once falling far enough behind to lose sight of. The highway had emptied out considerably since morning, just the occasional pair of taillights ahead of us, truckers running the overnight routes north toward the peninsula, and I kept the truck settled into that same steady rhythm that had carried us south that morning. Though everything about the return felt different from the drive down, heavier in some ways, and lighter in others. The particular mixture of a day that had cost something and given something back in equal measure. I did not turn the radio on. I kept the truck at a steady 65, the same speed I had held on the drive down, and somewhere past Milwaukee, Nell stirred and reached over without fully waking to rest her hand on my forearm. The way she has done on every long drive of our marriage, since before either of us could have said exactly when the habit started. We pulled into the driveway on Maple Point Road a little after midnight. I know the exact time because I looked at the dashboard clock before I cut the engine the way I always do when I come home from somewhere difficult, as though knowing the precise moment of return gives the return more weight than it would otherwise carry. The house sat dark and quiet, the automated beacon across the water sweeping its pale arc the same as it had every night for 30 years, indifferent to whatever had happened 130 miles south of it that evening. Odell and Marlene pulled in behind us a moment later, and the four of us stood together in the driveway for a while, under a sky gone clear and cold, our breath showing faintly in the porch light. Nobody in any hurry to be the first to say goodnight. "You did right tonight, Marcus," Odell said finally. "We all did," I said, and I meant it plainly, without needing to say anything more elaborate than that. Marlene hugged Nell for a long moment, and did not say anything at all, which struck me as exactly right the kind of silence that carries more than most sentences manage to. Odell shook my hand and held it an extra second before he let go, his grip firm and dry and familiar. The same handshake he had offered me across 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays over 4 decades. Then they crossed the yard toward their own house, their own porch light already glowing steady above the door, waiting the way it always waits, and Nell and I went inside and went to bed without saying much of anything further. The kind of tired that does not need words to explain itself. In the weeks that followed, the pieces settled the way pieces always settle. Not neatly, not without cost, but with the particular gravity of things finding their true level. Roland called on a Tuesday 3 days after the wedding. He asked for me specifically, and I could hear in the pause before he spoke a man rehearsing an apology he was not accustomed to having to give. He was not a man who apologized easily, and I could hear the shape of the sentence forming before he found the words to fill it. He told me he had read that clipping I mentioned about the newspaper coverage having tracked down his own copy through the local archive, and that he had thought of little else since Saturday night. He said he understood now that he had spent 37 years looking at the wrong things entirely. I told him I accepted that. I meant it. Derek called on a Wednesday. He was quiet for a long time before he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried a texture I had not heard in it for years. Something younger and less certain and more real than the voice he had been using at dinners and phone calls for the past 3 years running. "I didn't know about the clipping," he said. "I didn't know about Mom's letters or the extra shifts or what the fall actually did to your leg, permanently. I should have known. I should have asked." "Yes," I said. "You should have. We did not resolve everything on that call. We did not pretend to. But it was the first conversation in a long time that felt like it was happening between the actual people involved, rather than the versions of ourselves we had each spent 3 years deciding to present instead." "Were you scared?" Derek asked near the end of the call, his voice smaller than I had heard it since he was a boy. "That night in the water. Were you scared? I could have given him the same plain, factual answer I had given everyone for 37 years. Storm came in fast, boat went over. I pulled 3 men out. I did not give him that answer. Yes, I said. I was terrified the entire time. I have never told anyone that, not even your mother, not in so many words. I always thought a man wasn't supposed to say that part out loud. Derek was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. Thank you for telling me anyway, he said finally. That evening, after Nell had gone up to bed, I went out to the shed and stood in front of the anemometer clock on the wall. Silent now for 3 full weeks, the longest it had gone unwound since I first hung it there. I picked up the key, turned it in my hand once, and wound it 7 o'clock exactly, the needle beginning its slow, familiar sweep across a dial that had not measured actual wind in 30 years, and had never once in all that time stopped meaning something to the man who wound it. I have spent most of my life believing that love, the real, load-bearing kind, was something a man proved through what he was willing to carry alone, quietly, without ever setting the weight down where anyone else could see how heavy it actually was. I learned that from a father who told a 12-year-old boy at a funeral that grief did not belong in front of other people. And I have carried that lesson mostly, without questioning it, for 57 years since. I am beginning to understand now, slowly. The way a man understands most of the important things, too late to change the years already spent, but not too late to change the ones remaining. That the weight was never the proof. The proof was always going to be in whether I let someone else close enough to help me carry it. And for most of my life I did not. Nell still does not know everything about that night on the water. I have not told her about the fear the way I told Derek, not yet, though I suspect the telling is closer now than it has ever been. Sitting somewhere just on the other side of a conversation I have not quite worked up the nerve to start. Some wounds do not close all the way, no matter how much daylight finally reaches them. And I have decided I am done pretending otherwise to myself or to anyone else. By March, the anemometer clock in my shed had never once gone quiet again. 7 o'clock every evening, the same small ritual it had always been, except now, Nell sometimes stands in the doorway and watches me wind it. And some nights, I tell her something true while my hands are busy. The way it seems easier to say the hardest things when your fingers have somewhere else to be. I used to believe that love proved itself by what a man was willing to carry alone. My father taught me that at a funeral before I was old enough to know I had a choice about believing it. I carried that lesson for 57 years quietly, the way I carried a broken clock in a drawer, telling myself both were better left untouched. I understand now that the weight was never the proof of anything. The proof was always going to be in who I let close enough to help me hold it up. And for most of my life I chose to hold it alone, and called that choice strength. Derek and I are still finding our way back to each other slowly, one honest phone call at a time. Some nights I thank God for that slowness, because it means neither of us is pretending. I thank God, too, for Odell and Marlene, who chose us on a Tuesday without being asked, and for a young couple down the road who knock on our door now, the way we once knocked on theirs. I am not a man who talks about faith easily, but I will say this much, themselves. I believe God put good neighbors on that road 30 years before I ever needed them this badly. And I do not think that was an accident. Grace, I have come to believe, rarely announces itself. It simply shows up with a suitcase already packed. If you're the one still holding something alone tonight, certain that carrying it quietly is the same thing as loving someone well, I am asking you gently to reconsider that math before the years decide it for you. If a story like this found you tonight, I suspect it found you for a reason. So let me ask you the question I never let myself answer honestly until a wedding forced it out of me. If someone you loved asked you to hide the truest parts of yourself just to be allowed in the room, would you go anyway, quietly, and let your presence say what your mouth couldn't? Or would you finally set the weight down, where someone could see it? Tell me in the comments which one you would choose and why. If this story sat with you the way it sat with me while I was living it, share it with someone who needs to hear that carrying something alone was never proof of loving it enough. And if you want more evenings like this one, stay close. There are more stories to tell.